So part 2, I'm concentrating on his armour, and obviously the sword. I'm working on his sword at the moment. So I'm using a Createx illustration Payne's Grey, and I've got the mix fairly over reduced at the moment, so it's probably 70% reducer, 30% paint. So this just means I can do a slow build up. Just if I make any mistakes, they're easily fixed. I can erase them back with a hard eraser, which I'm using there. Or I've got a paintbrush that I've sharpened the end of, so when I want to do sharp highlights, I use that as well. So the idea behind the over reduced mix is I can do a slow build up. Just now I can map the project out using this mix, and it gives me something to work with when I darken the mix up, so I'll add more paint. Sometimes I'll add, so the mix will be 50-50 if I add more paint. Sometimes even if I really want to get a dark sharp line, I'll do 60% paint, 40% reducer. Just depends what I'm doing at the time, but whenever I'm trying to do a hard line, really sharp and dark, I'll bump up the mix a bit with more paint. So here I'm using a paper shield that I've cut out myself. Sometimes I find that the Mylar stencils on Yupo paper, which is what I'm using at the moment, I'm using Yupo paper. So the Mylar stencils can scratch it if you're not careful. So I found it's easier to work with a paper stent, like a paper freehand shield. So I just cut them out. You can cut them out to shape, whatever shape you need, which is quite handy, and just chuck them away when you're done. So you can see I'm slowly starting to build up the tones now, getting darker as I go. So I'll just go back and forth as I'm working through this. So like I said, I've bumped the mixture up a bit, added more paint, and then I'll actually add more reducer again, like I've done just there, to give myself another soft over reduced mix. So I just go back and forth. So every now and then I just want to get some hard detail in there. So because sometimes it's hard to build up with the over reduced mix. You've got to allow it to dry, and sometimes it's just too much reducer and you end up pushing, especially on Yupo paper, you can tend to push the paint away on the actual surface if there's too much reducer in the mix. So it is a balance, but it's all trial and error. So you can see here I'm starting to try and sharpen it up with a darker mix again, but I can still come in with the eraser. Well, I'm actually using a sharpened paintbrush there to knock back all that overspray. Gives me some harsh details, highlights. The good thing is I can come back in and dust over that with the Payne's Grey again, just to soften that up, because sometimes a really sharp highlight just doesn't suit the area. So that's easy to be fixed. So again, I've got an over reduced mix that I'm slowly trying to build up with. It is a bit of a tedious process. If I had this video playing in real time, it'd be probably way too long and way too boring. So I've had to speed it up 5 times. So 5 times, it still gives you the gist of what I'm doing, but it's not too slow that it's the video's not going to take too long. I've got so many videos that I had to edit, and if I kept them at real time, it would be, yeah, well, I couldn't even count how many hours I spent on this. then back and forth, just building up with the Payne's grey, then knocking back, giving it some highlight. It's starting to get some shape now. So moving on to the collar, you can see I'm gradually building up a bit of texture. So what I do with that is with the trigger, the airbrush trigger, it's a lot of back and forth. Just turning the paint on and off, basically keeping the air on though. Make sure you keep the air on. And just back and forth with the trigger very, very slightly. And that gives you a stippled effect, which it gives you the illusion of like a leather look. You see I also, after I lay down a light base, I redrew the stitching back in. I used the sharpened end of a paintbrush to do that. That just gives me my guidelines again, because I actually needed to go around each stitch with the airbrush again, which was fiddly, but it worked out quite well. Just got to make sure the airbrush is running well before you commit to it. So here you'll see again I've added a bit of texture with paint, the eraser, and then adding the stitching back in. And using a freehand shield made out of paper. You see I'm working around each stitching with the mix I got. Try not to use too many stencils on this because I didn't want it to be too sharp. The reference picture has a lot of soft edges on it, so just have to be sparing with the stencils, freehand shields. Again, just mapping in those stitches. That collar actually, the collar will get a dose of red violet, I think I put through there. So just an added colour to it, the depth. But that'll be in a later video. So this chainmail was, I was a little bit worried about this. I held off because I wasn't sure how I was going to tackle it. So I kind of danced around that a little bit. I had an idea on what I wanted to do, and it didn't actually work out as planned. But that's fine. That's all. This was a learning experience as well for me, because it was fairly detailed, the chainmail, and trying to look at a pattern, it's hard to see, to transfer that same pattern onto their painting. But you'll see how the process changed over the course of the painting. The chainmail that's around his stomach did turn out much better than the chainmail across the shoulders, because I did come up with a better technique. The problem with the chainmail that I had going around the shoulders there is it wasn't mapped out very well. So to follow any sort of shape with the airbrush, it just wasn't going to work, because the shapes just they just didn't come up that well. No, I jump around a little bit, so just to keep it interesting, I don't try not to work in the one spot for too long. So that was the idea behind the chainmail. I figured I'd actually work in the darkest areas first, and then I can actually add the highlights to it. But because I didn't have the pattern laid out properly, it didn't really work. It did kind of turn out into a bit of a mess. So there was a lot of back and forth with that, but I did get there in the end. And sorry, the camera does go out of focus a fair bit here. I hadn't worked out exactly how to lock the focus down onto the project on this using my phone. I'm still, at this point I was still learning how to use it, so I did actually eventually work out how to lock the focus, which was good for the later videos. But yeah, you will notice that it drops out of focus. It's trying to focus on my hand, which is great if you wanted to watch my hand, but I'm sure you don't. So the airbrush I'm using is the Iwata HP SB Plus, and it is it's very capable of some extremely high detail work. You see on the chain that I just did there, I was able to lay down some very sharp shadows on it. It's a really good airbrush for that. So this is probably my favourite airbrush that I use it probably 95% of the time. Every now and then I do jump back to my Iwata HP CH, which is also another very good airbrush. I do have a micron, but I don't use it that much anymore. Awesome airbrush, but they are very expensive to fix if you damage them, so I learned that the hard way. Again, going out of focus. So this does happen. I'll let you know now, it does happen a fair bit through this video. I didn't want to get rid of the. I still wanted to keep the video in here because you can kind of see what I'm doing. Otherwise, I would have lost the video completely. So I have left it in here, and just letting you know that the next videos that I do, there'll be a lot less of this. Because I did actually finally work out how to use the phone. So just going back over areas, darken them up. So this would be a fairly heavy mix, so probably closer to 50-50, and just working in those details, the dark areas around the stitching. And if that was in focus, you'd be able to see when I'm adding all the dark areas under the hair. Biggest problem with working detail this fine and having a fairly thick mix is there's a lot of tip dry, so you probably don't notice it in these videos because it's sped up so much, but I am stopping probably every 15 to 20 seconds to pick paint off the needle, which it's a pain in the ass, but I'm so used to it now that I don't even know that I'm doing it. When you've got an over reduced mix, the paint dry is not so bad. But in saying that, you can't produce the detail as much as you can with a thicker mix. Again, just adding more texture. That's just under the buckle there is a bit more of the the leather. And see how much I hate doing that chainmail. I'll do a little bit, then I'll disappear off to another area of the project and work on that for probably a few hours, and eventually go back to it. I figured the more I built up all the other areas around it, the chainmail might be a little bit easier to do, because I can actually compare it to the rest of the project basically. The other challenge was the strapping around it to try and make it look like it had a leather look to it. Again, just building up lightly, putting all my textures in with that over reduced mix. And as I go back over top of that, those textures do shine through. Again, just adding some shadows, some drop shadows in there, freehand, just because it gives a softer effect. I do use a little bit of a freehand shield just to get myself a rough line as well, which I'll show that in a moment. Adding some stitching in the leather straps there. That looks a bit more impressive than it actually is. That I didn't do it that quick in real life. that was quite slow. Just gotta make sure, like I said before, the airbrush is running right before you do stuff like that. Otherwise you might end up with a big spot on the page, and then you got to fix that up. A lot of shadows from the branches across the armour. I'm just adding in there. I keep them fairly light for now, just because I want to make sure they're in the right spot. And as I go around darkening this piece up, I can actually darken those shadows up as well. Just I can thicken them up, change the direction slightly of them, just in case they're not right. Another odd freehand shield that I'm cut up. You see there, I've used that to create some shadows under the straps. Come up a little bit sharp, so I do have to fix that up. I'll soften those up a bit. Otherwise it looks a bit out of place. You can see it's starting to resemble something now. So very, very slowly. Like I said, this will get a wash of blue violet over the top of it once it's all completed, and then I'll go around and with a white mix and just highlight areas, bring the highlights back up. Doing it that way, it gives me a softer highlight rather than using a paintbrush or the eraser, the sharpened paintbrush. Yeah, sorry about that. Out of focus again. I'm not very tech savvy, so... but I do work it out. Now that was a big area of chainmail that I was very scared to tackle. So, holding off on that one. You can see how effective the freehand shields are. Just gives me something to, like a guideline to work with. Then you just freehand the rest of it in. Some people complain about the use of stencils, but if you use them right, you wouldn't even know. So that's how I like to use them anyway. Just gives yourself a guideline, come back in and freehand the rest. And it doesn't even look like you've used a shield at all. You see I'm just continually going over that area, very, very slowly darkening it up. Don't want to do it too quickly, otherwise you lose the texture that I've built up on the bottom layers. That will be hair. That's some severed heads in the foreground. So I'm just working in some of that detail now, just give me an idea on where it sits. It's likely to completely change, but it's just a guideline. So the two main colours that I noticed were in this, or in the armour, is it's like a blue violet and a red violet. I also use a darker purple as well for some of the darkest areas, but that's why the Payne grey is good. It's a good base colour. It sets it up for the use of those cooler colours. So the darker purple and also the red violet actually reacts quite well with the base blue. But for now, it's all about building up all that the mid-tone with that Payne's grey mix. I'm not too concerned about colour at all at this stage. That's very end, right at the very end, I'll add that. More buckle. Every now and then I just work my way around, just adding highlights in, bringing highlights to the front, sharpening things up. That's going to be a rope. I'll scratch some fibres into that. That's just again just a rough guideline. That may change when I come in, because that's going to be a mixture of red violet, Payne's grey, and even a little bit of sepia. Just erasing some texture into that area there. I'm keeping these videos to about half an hour just so they're not too long. So this does, this is pretty much at the end of the second video. There's probably going to be another good handful of videos show the rest of the process. But for now I just wanted to keep it fairly short.